The ballroom of the Brookshire Country Club glittered with chandeliers and laughter when Clara Benson realized her own daughter didn't recognize her. She stood near the entrance, clutching a small wrapped box she had spent 3 months saving for. Her daughter Lila, in her silk gown, looked straight at her and said calmly, "Excuse me, but the staff entrance is in the back." Clara blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Lila," she said softly, her voice trembling. But Lila didn't flinch. She turned to her groom, Julian Thornwell, and smiled as though nothing had happened. Around them, Boston's finest exchanged amused glances. "Your staff should really know better than to use the front entrance," said a tall woman beside Lila. It was Julian's mother, Margaret Thornwell, her pearls gleaming like tiny snowballs. She laughed, the kind of laugh that didn't warm the air. Clara's fingers tightened around the gift box. Her navy blue dress, bought on clearance and pressed to perfection, suddenly felt like a costume from another world. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, her voice steady despite the sting. "I must have made a mistake." The security guard, a kind-faced man in his 50s, approached carefully. "Ma'am, if you could just—" "Of course," Clara interrupted softly. "No scene." She turned to leave, dignity her only armor. But before she stepped away, she glanced at Lila once more. And for a fleeting second, beneath the polished smile, she saw recognition. Her daughter knew exactly who she was, and had chosen to pretend otherwise. As Clara stepped out into the marble-floored lobby, something inside her cracked. It wasn't her heart, that had been breaking slowly for 2 years. This was her last thread of hope snapping clean in half. She thought, you raise a child for 29 years, through scraped knees and heartbreak, and this is what you get, erased in public. But that moment of humiliation didn't begin at the wedding. It began 18 months earlier, when Lila brought Julian home for dinner. "Mom, this is Julian," she'd said, her tone oddly careful, like someone testing new shoes. Julian was handsome in a corporate sort of way. Expensive watch, perfect smile, the kind of man who'd never waited in line for anything. "Mrs. Benson," he'd said, extending his hand. "Lila's told me so much about you." What he meant, Clara would later realize, was that Lila had told him just enough to make her small. That night, Clara had cooked her best meal: pot roast, mashed potatoes, and green beans from her little garden. The same meal she'd made for every birthday and celebration in Lila's life. But Julian had only poked at his food, murmuring, "This is very authentic." That word clung to Clara's skin like grease. "It's my mother's recipe," she said. "We've been making it since I was a girl." Julian only smiled politely. Lila watched him closely, as if seeking approval for everything she once took pride in. Later, when Julian's parents visited, Margaret had surveyed Clara's modest apartment like she was evaluating a museum exhibit. "How quaint," she'd said, smiling tightly. Clara had laughed it off at the time, pretending it didn't sting. But that was the first hairline crack between mother and daughter, the one that would split open the day of the wedding. The phone call that sealed their distance came on a Tuesday evening in March. Clara was sitting at her kitchen table, reviewing insurance claims, when Lila's name appeared on her phone. "Mom, we need to talk," Lila said. "No hello, no warmth. Just business." "Of course, honey. What's going on?" Clara asked, already uneasy. "It's about the wedding," Lila said, her voice muffled by chatter in the background. "We're adjusting the guest list. Bradley's. Sorry, Julian's family. Want something more formal. You know, traditional." "Adjusting," Clara repeated, setting her pen down. "What kind of adjustments?" Lila hesitated. "It's just, some of your friends might not feel comfortable in that environment. It's going to be very upscale." "You mean they might embarrass you?" Clara asked quietly. "That's not what I said, Mom," Lila replied, but her silence said everything. When Clara finally asked how many guests she was allowed, Lila's answer landed like a slap. 3 seats for your side. You, Aunt Carol, and Mrs. Patterson from next door." Clara had stared at the phone, her mouth dry. 3 seats, she echoed. "It's not personal," Lila said. We just want everyone to feel comfortable. That night, Clara sat alone, surrounded by photo albums. Every birthday, every school play, every scraped knee, all reduced to 3 seats at her only daughter's wedding. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat in her living room until dawn, the photo albums spread open on her lap. There was Lila at 5, holding a stuffed bear with a missing ear. Lila at 12, winning the school spelling bee. Lila at 17, crying over her first heartbreak. Every memory whispered the same question. How did we end up here? She had worked overtime shifts, skipped vacations, and poured every ounce of love she had into raising her. But apparently, love was the cheapest thing at the Thornwell table. When Clara finally met Julian's parents in person, she understood what she was up against. Their Beacon Hill mansion felt more like a museum than a home. Grand staircase, oil paintings, and silence heavy enough to smother laughter. Margaret Thornwell greeted her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Dorothy. Oh, I mean Clara. How lovely to finally meet you. She said Clara's name as if tasting something sour. Please call me Clara, she replied politely. Oh, I couldn't possibly, Margaret said with a tinkling laugh. Names say so much about upbringing. Julian's father, Charles Thornwell, barely looked up from his newspaper. Melissa tells us you work in insurance, Margaret continued, leading Clara past a dining table that could seat 20. I do, Clara said. Claims adjustment. I help people rebuild after disasters. How noble, Margaret murmured, her tone flat. Charles, isn't that touching? Helping the unfortunate. Charles grunted. Indeed. Clara smiled faintly. She'd spent decades learning to survive that kind of condescension. Polite cruelty served with silver spoons. Dinner was worse. They seated Clara between Julian's great-aunt Edna, who was half-deaf, and his cousin Trevor, who was half-drunk. So Clara, Charles said as the soup was served, Lila mentioned you raised her alone. That must have been quite the challenge. It had its moments, Clara said calmly. Margaret leaned forward, eyes gleaming. Well, you must be so proud she's finally found stability. Trevor chuckled into his wine. Stability. She means money, darling. Even Lila blushed. Trevor, please, she whispered. But she didn't defend her mother. As the evening went on, Clara felt herself shrinking smaller and smaller. Every compliment came wrapped in pity. Every question carried a judgment. You must find Boston overwhelming, Margaret said sweetly. Such a big city for someone from. Where was it again? Hartford, Clara replied. Ah yes, how quaint. The word hit harder than any insult. By dessert, Clara realized they weren't just trying to intimidate her. They were rewriting her place in Lila's life. Driving home that night, Clara gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She replayed the dinner over and over, each insult sharper than the last. But what hurt most wasn't Margaret's sneer or Charles's coldness. It was Lila's silence. The little girl who once said, "Mom, you're my whole world," now sat at a table and let strangers make her mother small. That silence was its own betrayal. Months passed. Wedding plans moved forward without Clara's input. She learned through social media that Lila had chosen a French designer for her gown, that the venue had changed to the Brookshire Country Club, and that the rehearsal dinner was family only. Family apparently didn't include her. I'm so sorry, Mom, Lila said on the phone one evening. It's just complicated. What's complicated about love? Clara asked softly. You either honor it or you don't. Lila sighed. You don't understand, Mom. It's just different now. By the time the wedding week arrived, Clara's excitement had been replaced with dread. Still, she told herself, you'll be proud. You'll show grace. She spent 3 months working overtime at the insurance office to buy her dress, a simple navy piece with pearl buttons, and a small antique jewelry box as a gift. She couldn't compete with the Thornwells' luxury, but her love was handcrafted. That had to count for something. The morning of the wedding, rain tapped against her window like a quiet warning. Clara dressed carefully, fixing her hair the way Lila used to like, soft curls at the ends. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she whispered, "You've done your best." The drive from Hartford to Boston felt endless. Her old Honda looked out of place among the luxury cars in the club's parking lot, but she parked anyway, clutching the jewelry box like it was sacred. Inside the ballroom, everything sparkled. Crystal chandeliers, white roses, champagne flutes. It was a fairy tale built from money and appearances. Guests whispered greetings that smelled of wealth and perfume. Clara stood by the gift table, trying to blend in. Then she heard Margaret's voice drift through the air. "Such a diverse mix of guests today. Lila has such a generous heart." The laughter that followed said exactly what they meant. Lila had invited someone beneath them. Clara looked down at her gift and smiled sadly. "At least it came from love," she murmured. Then, like a dream she couldn't wake from, Clara saw her daughter descend the grand staircase. Lila floated down in a white satin gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. For one brief moment, all of Clara's pain melted away. That was her little girl, the same child she'd walked to kindergarten, the same girl who used to fall asleep on her shoulder during storms. Clara's eyes filled with pride. But when Lila's gaze met hers, everything changed. A flicker of panic crossed Lila's face before she quickly composed herself, gliding past her mother as though she were invisible. "Lila," Clara whispered, stepping forward. But Lila didn't turn. Margaret Thornwell swooped in, kissing her new daughter-in-law on both cheeks. "You look absolutely radiant, darling," she said. "Everyone is simply dying to meet you." The guests applauded softly, the kind of applause reserved for royalty. Clara stood frozen near the gift table, feeling like a ghost at her own child's celebration. "Ma'am," a young server said kindly, appearing at Clara's side. She was a college student, barely 20. "Would you like me to show you to your seat? The ceremony is about to begin." "Yes, please," Clara replied quietly. The girl led her through the crowd, weaving between laughing guests in designer clothes. Clara's seat was in the last row, behind a marble column that blocked half her view of the altar. The front rows gleamed with Thornwells, jewels, tuxedos, and practiced smiles. Her sister Carol arrived moments later, whispering, "Well, this is cozy." Her humor was sharp, the kind that only came from surviving life's smaller humiliations. "Did you see the gift table?" she asked. "There's one from the governor." Clara managed a faint smile. "And one from me," she said. Carol squeezed her hand. "Yours will mean more than all of theirs combined." The music began, soft and elegant. Bridesmaids in blush pink floated down the aisle, followed by a flower girl scattering rose petals with solemn concentration. Then Lila appeared on her father-in-law's arm. Clara's breath caught. Her father-in-law's. She had always assumed Lila would walk alone in memory of her late father. Instead, she'd chosen to be escorted by the man whose wife had treated Clara like dirt. That quiet exchange, one arm offered, one accepted, felt like the final erasure. As Lila walked past, her eyes flicked toward the back of the room. For half a heartbeat, they locked on Clara's. Regret, shame, or just curiosity? Clara couldn't tell. Whatever emotion had surfaced was quickly buried beneath a perfect smile. The vows began. The minister spoke of legacy, tradition, and family values, words that sliced through Clara like glass. She wanted to laugh, to stand and say, "Which family? The one she came from, or the one that bought her?" But she stayed silent. After the ceremony, guests flooded into the reception hall, their voices filling the air like the hum of bees. Clara lingered near the doorway, uncertain where to stand. That's when a woman in a silver gown approached, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "You must be Mrs. Benson," she said smoothly. "I'm Vivian Ashworth, Margaret's sister. I understand you're helping with the service today." Clara blinked. "I'm sorry." "Yes, dear," Vivian continued, pressing an empty champagne glass into Clara's hand. "Be a dear and fetch me another glass of Dom Perignon, would you?" For a long second, Clara stood frozen, the glass trembling in her hand. Then she said softly, I think there's been a misunderstanding. But Vivian had already turned away, joining a cluster of women laughing near the piano. Clara placed the glass on a nearby tray and straightened her shoulders. The humiliation burned, but her dignity refused to break. Around her, the laughter and clinking of crystal filled the air, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing inside one woman's heart. Then another voice, gentler this time. "Ma'am, are you okay?" It was the young server from earlier. Her name tag read Ellie. "You look a little lost." Clara smiled weakly. "Just finding my bearings." Ellie hesitated, glancing around. "I don't mean to offend, but my supervisor said all family members are seated at the head table. Are you supposed to be working this event?" The question pierced deeper than any insult. Clara took a steady breath and said quietly, "No, sweetheart. I'm not staff. I'm the bride's mother." Ellie's eyes widened in horror. "Oh my God. I'm so sorry. Mrs. Thornwell told us." She stopped herself. "It's all right," Clara said, her tone calm but firm. "Seems there's been a bit of confusion." Ellie shook her head. "No, ma'am. There's been cruelty." Clara managed a small smile. "Maybe. But I'm used to surviving worse." She turned then, looking across the room at her daughter laughing under the chandeliers. Lila glowed with happiness, surrounded by people who thought money was the only kind of worth. But Clara knew something they didn't. She wasn't done yet. Dinner was announced with the kind of grandeur usually reserved for royalty. Waiters in white gloves opened double doors to reveal the dining hall, a sea of gold-rimmed china, crystal chandeliers, and centerpieces taller than Clara's torso. "Please everyone find your seats," the event planner sang into the microphone. Clara glanced at the seating chart. Her name was tucked into the very last line. Table 19, near rear exit. She smiled tightly. Of course her tablemates were an odd collection. The florist, the photographer's assistant, two elderly cousins too deaf to catch much conversation, and a guest whose date had abandoned her for better company. "Well," cousin Eleonora muttered, adjusting her shawl, "this is the island of misfit toys." Clara chuckled quietly. "Seems fitting." "You're the mother, right?" Eleonora asked, squinting. "Of the bride." Clara nodded. "In name only, it seems." Meanwhile, laughter and champagne bubbled from the head table like an exclusive club. Lila sat between Julian and his parents, her smile rehearsed and flawless. Every few minutes, photographers circled her like bees around honey. Margaret Thornwell beamed proudly as if she'd personally designed the marriage. Clara watched from a distance, sipping water and pretending it was enough. When the main course arrived, filet mignon with truffle mashed potatoes, Clara noticed her portion was missing. "Excuse me," she said softly to a waiter. "I believe my plate was skipped." The young man frowned, checking his list. "Oh, sorry, ma'am. There was no meal ordered for this seat. I'll fix it." "No need," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "I've already had my fill." The waiter smiled sadly, sensing what she didn't say. Halfway through dinner, a guest at the next table whispered loudly, "I thought staff weren't allowed to sit." Clara didn't turn. She had learned long ago that silence sometimes screamed louder than words. But inside, her chest ached with a familiar raw pain. This wasn't just about being excluded. It was about being erased. Her motherhood rewritten as a footnote in someone else's fairy tale. Across the hall, Julian raised his glass. "To my beautiful wife Lila, and to our families, old and new, who made today possible." Applause rippled through the crowd. Clara lifted her water, though no one noticed. "To family," she whispered. But the word tasted hollow. Then came the toast. Margaret stood first. "Marriage," she said, "is not just about love. It's about legacy." She smiled toward the crowd, her diamond necklace catching the light. "And today, our families join not only in celebration but in elevation." Laughter and polite clapping followed. Clara's stomach turned. Elevation. As if her daughter had climbed out of the mud. When Julian spoke next, He mentioned his parents, his mentors, his colleagues, but not once did he say Clara's name. The omission was so deliberate it was almost artistic. Even Lila didn't look her way. The applause that followed was thunderous, and Clara's heartbeat matched it, steady and sharp. She sat perfectly still, her face calm. But something inside her shifted, like a lock clicking open. Then came the moment no one expected. The microphone was placed on the stand for open remarks. Would anyone else like to say a few words? The MC asked cheerfully. Silence. No one moved. And then slowly Clara stood. The room quieted. Even the string quartet faltered mid-note. She walked to the front, her navy dress brushing the marble floor, the faint sound of her heels echoing in the silence. Margaret's smile froze. Julian's fork clinked against his plate. Lila's eyes widened, not with joy but with dread. Clara reached the microphone, adjusted it with trembling fingers, and looked out over the glittering sea of strangers. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and clear. Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry for the interruption. My name is Clara Benson. She paused deliberately. Some of you may not recognize me. That's understandable. I wasn't properly introduced. The room went still. Forks hovered midair. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Clara smiled softly, her voice steady as she continued. I'm not staff, though I was mistaken for one earlier. I'm actually the bride's mother. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a sudden wind. Lila's hand flew to her chest, her face drained of color. Margaret Thornwell's eyes widened, but she quickly recovered, her lips tightening into that same polished smile that had always made Clara feel small. I wasn't sure I should speak tonight, Clara went on. After all, I wasn't listed on the official program. Nervous laughter flickered around the tables, quickly dying under her calm gaze. But I wanted to thank everyone here for coming. You see, every parent dreams of seeing their child happy. You did too. I worked double shifts, skipped vacations, and gave up everything to make sure my daughter had choices I never had. Lila's lips parted slightly. Mom, she whispered, but it was too soft to stop anything. Clara smiled at her, not with anger but with something deeper. And she chose well. A beautiful wedding, a successful husband, a fine family. I'm proud of her for building a life that shines so bright. She looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of the wealthy guests who had mocked her earlier. But what you may not know, she continued, is that light sometimes blinds the one who created it. The words hung heavy in the air. Even the servers had stopped moving. When Lila was 7, Clara said softly, her father died in an accident. It was just the two of us after that. I didn't have much, but I had her. And that was enough. Every scraped knee, every sleepless night, every small success. I was there. Not because I had to be. Because I wanted to be. Her voice trembled slightly, then steadied again. That's what love looks like. It doesn't always wear designer clothes. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, whispering something to her husband, but Clara continued unfazed. I know I don't belong in rooms like this, she said. I can't tell a Bordeaux from a Burgundy. I buy dresses from clearance racks. And my car has a dent in the door I keep promising to fix. But I do know what it means to stand by someone, even when it's inconvenient. Especially then. Her gaze softened as it landed on her daughter. Lila, you don't owe me perfection. You don't even owe me gratitude. You owe yourself honesty. And I hope someday you'll look in the mirror and remember where you came from. Because there's power in remembering. A hush fell so deep that even the chandeliers seemed to listen. Then Clara lifted the small wrapped box she'd carried all evening. I brought you a gift, she said. I wasn't sure if it would make it to your table, so I'll give it to you myself. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a handcrafted jewelry box. Its maple wood polished to a soft glow. This belonged to my mother, Clara said. She gave it to me when I got married. I wanted you to have it. Not because it's expensive but because it's real. The crowd was utterly silent. Even Julian looked uncertain now. His polished confidence cracking at the edges. Real things last, Clara continued. They may get scratched, they may get overlooked, but they endure. Kind of like mothers. Her smile was gentle but laced with steel. I hope one day when you open this box, you'll remember that she placed the jewelry box on the head table beside Lila's untouched champagne glass. Then she turned toward the guests, giving a small nod. Thank you for letting me say a few words. I'll take my leave now. The staff door, as someone kindly pointed out, is in the back. The quiet gasp that followed was almost musical. Clara stepped down from the stage, her heels clicking softly, a metronome of dignity. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the orchestra forgot to play. Clara walked past tables of frozen faces, past Margaret's wide eyes and Julian's pale confusion, past her daughter whose tears had begun to fall in silence. The woman everyone had dismissed now owned the room. And as she reached the exit, the same young server, Ellie, whispered that was beautiful. Clara smiled faintly. It was necessary. Then she walked out into the cool Boston night, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Outside, the rain had stopped. The parking lot shimmered beneath the streetlights, each puddle reflecting the glow of the ballroom behind her. Clara paused for a moment, breathing in the cool night air. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but release. For the first time in years, she wasn't walking away as someone forgotten. She was walking away as someone free. Inside, the silence lingered. Lila sat motionless, staring at the jewelry box her mother had left behind. Around her, the guests whispered, unsure what to say. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearing his throat. Well, he began, trying to recover the mood. Shall we? Don't, Lila said sharply, her voice breaking. Julian froze. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, She's right. Margaret leaned closer, her voice clipped. Lila, darling, this isn't the time for dramatics. The photographers. Enough. Lila's voice echoed through the hall. You all treated her like she was nothing. Her hands shook as she pointed at the stunned guests. That woman worked herself to the bone to give me a life better than her own. And I stood here and pretended I didn't know her. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks as gasps rippled through the room again. Lila, Margaret hissed, trying to maintain control. We'll handle this privately. Lila shook her head, her voice trembling. No, Mrs. Thornwell. You already handled it, publicly. She turned and ran from the table, her gown brushing against the marble floor as whispers followed her like smoke. Outside, Clara was unlocking her old Honda when she heard footsteps. Mom! Lila's voice cut through the night air. Clara turned slowly. Lila stood in the rain, barefoot now, her wedding dress dragging across the wet pavement. Her makeup was ruined, her perfect hair undone, but for the first time in months, her face looked real. Mom, wait. Clara sighed softly, leaning against her car. Go back inside, Lila. You'll catch a cold. I can't, Lila said. Not without saying I'm sorry. Her voice cracked. I was so afraid of not fitting in, of not being enough for them. And I thought if I became more like them, I could make you proud. Clara's eyes softened. You don't have to become them for me to be proud of you, sweetheart. You just have to remember who you are. For a long moment, mother and daughter stood there, the rain falling softly around them. Then Lila stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Clara, sobbing into her shoulder. I don't deserve your forgiveness, she whispered. Clara held her tight. Forgiveness isn't earned, Lila. It's given. And it's yours. The two of them stayed like that until the rain faded into mist. When they finally pulled apart, Lila's expression was one of quiet resolve. I don't want to go back in there, she said. Clara smiled faintly. Then don't. You can start fresh, tonight if you choose. But what about them? Lila asked, glancing back toward the glowing windows of the ballroom. Clara shook her head. Let the Thornwells finish their dinner. You've already had your awakening. A week later, photos from the wedding appeared in the local papers, but none of them told the real story. The Thornwells tried to control the narrative, whispers of an emotional misunderstanding, and a tired guest who overstepped. But those who were there remembered differently. They remembered the quiet woman in the navy dress who stood with more grace than any of them combined. Months passed. Clara returned to her modest home in Hartford, her heart lighter than it had been in years. One afternoon, she received a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a note written in familiar handwriting. "Mom, I sold my ring. I paid off your mortgage. I don't know if I can ever make it right, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying.